somehow Celeste Ng sneaked past Politics and Prose when the book, when Everything I Never Told You came out in hardcover. And so when the book was published just a couple of weeks ago in paperback, Politics and Prose was determined that it wasn't going to happen again. And so they snagged her. And they just weren't going to let her go this time, which is just wonderful because the booksellers here at Politics and Prose have just loved hand-selling this book. It's been a favorite ever since it came out. In hardcover. And it was just about 2 weeks ago that it came out in paperback. And Porter Square Books, which is Celeste's local bookstore in Cambridge, did a launch party for her, and they had a special cake. I saw a picture of it online. And on the cake, there was the cover of the book was iced onto the icing, and it looked just fantastic. It looked so good, you just wouldn't want to cut into it to eat any of it. I hope you got lots of pictures of it, Celeste. Yeah. Okay. It's not only been a favorite of our booksellers here, but has also appeared. Everything I Never Told You was a New York Times bestseller, and it was chosen by at least a dozen magazines and newspapers as the best book of the year. And now it's just gone to number 5. Just after it's been out for 2 weeks on the indie bookstore's bestseller list. So that's a fantastic feat. I'm just really, really proud of Celeste for that. Celeste grew up in Pittsburgh and in Shaker Heights. Shaker Heights is a very nice suburb of Cleveland. It is not like the small town in Ohio in which that Celeste's book is set. She did her undergraduate work at Harvard and received her MFA in English in writing from the University of Michigan. And while she was at Michigan, she won something called the Hopwood Award. And that's something that, according to Nicholas Delbanco, who is the English professor and director of the Hopwood Awards program, where
he might be slightly biased about the Hopwood Awards because he directs the program.
Yeah, no. I was just going to say that he directs the program, but he says this is the oldest and best-known series of writing prizes in the country, and it is a good indicator of future success. Well, that has proved to be precisely true because Celeste has received the Pushcart Prize. She won the 2014-2015 Asian Pacific American Award for adult fiction, and also the Alex Award, which is an award given by the American Library Association. And even before the hardcover was published, it was given starred reviews by Publishers Weekly, the Library Journal, and Book List. So it's just a wonderful set of awards that Celeste has gotten for her first novel. And I think that Nicholas Delbanco is exactly right, that she has a great career ahead of her. So I'm just excited to have her here this evening. Thank you, Celeste. So here, come on and come to the mic here. Come on, behind me. Okay, thanks.
Thank you so much for that introduction, which is quite an introduction to live up to. And thank you all so much for coming. And huge thanks to Politics and Prose for having me here. This is a long, long time ago. I came to DC, and multiple people said to me, while you're there, you have to make time to go to this really great bookstore. It's called Politics and Prose. And by the time the third or fourth person had told me that, I was like, well, I have to go. And so I did. And then since then, I just have never been able to come back to the store. So I'm really thrilled to be coming here as an author. So thank you to the store for having me. So not to put anybody on the spot, but I'm curious, have some of you read the book already? Okay, so actually a lot of you have read the book already. So I think what I will do is, instead of the sort of typical reading where I stand here and read the book to you that you have already read, I think what I'll do is I'm going to read a very short section from the beginning for the people who haven't read the book. And then what I'll do is I'll talk to you a little bit about sort of where the idea for the book came from and where the ideas for the characters came from. And then I'll be happy to take questions afterwards. So this is your fair warning to think of some questions. And I was told that you will have to come up to a microphone to ask questions, so be prepared. All right, so I'll start off by reading a little bit from the very, very beginning of the book. This is chapter 1, page 1, so you don't need to know anything coming into this story. Lydia is dead, but they don't know this yet. 1977, May 3rd, 6:30 in the morning. No one knows anything but this innocuous fact. Lydia is late for breakfast. As always, next to her cereal bowl, her mother has placed a sharpened pencil and Lydia's physics homework, 6 problems flagged with small ticks. Driving to work, Lydia's father nudges the dial toward WXKP, Northwest Ohio's best news source, vexed by the crackles of static. On the stairs, Lydia's brother yawns, still twined in the tail end of his dream. And in her chair in the corner of the kitchen, Lydia's sister hunches, moon-eyed over her cornflakes, sucking them to pieces one by one, waiting for Lydia to appear. It's she who says, at last, "Lydia's taking a long time today." Upstairs, Marilyn opens her daughter's door and sees the bed unslept in. Neat hospital corners still pleated beneath the comforter, pillows still fluffed and convex. Nothing seems out of place. Mustard-colored corduroys tangled on the floor, a single rainbow-striped sock. A row of science fair ribbons on the wall, a postcard of Einstein. Lydia's duffel bag crumpled on the floor of the closet. Lydia's green book bag slouched against her desk. Lydia's bottle of Baby Soft atop the dresser, a sweet, powdery, loved baby scent still in the air. But no Lydia. Marilyn closes her eyes. Maybe when she opens them, Lydia will be there, covers pulled over her head as usual, wisps of hair trailing from beneath. A grumpy lump bundled under the bedspread that she'd somehow missed before. "I was in the bathroom, Mom. I went downstairs for some water. I was lying right here all the time." Of course, when she looks, nothing has changed. The closed curtains glow like a blank television screen. Downstairs, she stops in the doorway of the kitchen, a hand on each side of the frame. Her silence says everything. "I'll check outside," she says at last. "Maybe, for some reason..." She keeps her gaze trained on the floor as she heads for the front door, as if Lydia's footprints might be crushed into the hall runner. Nath says to Hannah, "She was in her room last night. I heard her radio playing at 11:30. He stops, remembering that he had not said goodnight. "Can you be kidnapped if you're 16? Hannah asks. Nath prods at his bowl with a spoon. Cornflakes wilt and sink into clouded milk. Their mother steps back into the kitchen, and for one glorious fraction of a second, Nath sighs with relief. There she is, Lydia, safe and sound. It happens sometimes. Their faces are so alike you'd see one in the corner of your eye and mistake her for the other. The same elfish chin and high cheekbones and left cheek dimple, the same thin-shouldered build. Only the hair color is different. Lydia's ink black instead of their mother's honey blonde. He and Hannah take after their father. Once a woman stopped the two of them in the grocery store and asked, "Chinese?" And when they said yes, not wanting to get into halves and wholes, she'd nodded sagely. "I knew it," she said, by the eyes. She'd tugged the corner of each eye outward with a fingertip. But Lydia, defying genetics, somehow has her mother's blue eyes, and they know this is one more reason she is their mother's favorite, and their father's too. Then Lydia raises one hand to her brow and becomes his mother again. "The car's still here," she says, but Nath had known it would be. Lydia can't drive. She doesn't even have a learner's permit yet. Last week she'd surprised them all by failing the exam, and their father wouldn't even let her sit in the driver's seat without it. Nath stirs his cereal, which has turned to sludge at the bottom of his bowl. The clock in the front hall ticks, then strikes 7:30. No one moves. "Are we still going to school today?" Hannah asks. Marilyn hesitates. Then she goes to her purse and takes out her keychain with a show of efficiency. "You've both missed the bus. Nath, take my car and drop Hannah off on your way." Then, Don't worry, we'll find out what's going on. She doesn't look at either of them. Neither looks at her. I'll stop with the reading there, but we, the readers, already know that it doesn't end well, that Lydia, in fact, is dead, and the family soon finds out that Lydia has drowned in the town's lake. And this reveals a web of secrets that the family has to sort of grapple with if they're going to survive this tragedy. So the plot itself is not based on anything in my life. I obviously didn't drown in a lake. But the sort of larger thematic issues did sort of come from some things that happened in my adolescence. As you heard in the introduction, I grew up in a place called Shaker Heights, which is a really lovely suburb of Cleveland. It's fairly affluent. There's a lot of trees. There's a lot of beautiful brick buildings. It's very progressive. It was a really nice place to grow up. But sort of by a horrible coincidence, during the time that I lived there, the 10 years that I was there from my childhood when I moved there till I left for college, 3 young women from the high school were actually murdered in different ways. One of them was found stabbed on the street in the middle of the night. One of them was shot in front of the police station by a boy who had been stalking her. And one of them, who had been a classmate of mine after we went to college, was kidnapped by a stranger and murdered. And so this had a really big effect on me, as you can imagine, as I think it would have on anyone. It's a horrible tragedy when anyone sort of dies in this sudden way. But it really made a big impression because it was sort of the first experience that I had had with death and with someone who was sort of my age dying. Not someone who had been elderly or not someone who had been ill. And it also made a huge impression on me because I had known them and I knew the world that they came from. Or I thought that I knew the world that they had come from. Because after this, I started to wonder, were there things in their lives that we didn't know about? Not that this was in any way their fault, but was there something that we could have picked up on that would have prevented this, or ways that we could have saved them? And I thought a lot, too, because I had known some of their family members, about how families could go on after such a tragedy. How could you manage to keep getting up and going on day by day? And so those were some of the things that I wanted to sort of explore on a larger level in the novel. So there's a mystery at the heart of the book about sort of what happened to this young woman, Lydia, but it's really a family story, and it's really sort of about the relationships between the family members. So because it's a family story, let me introduce you to the family members in the novel and tell you sort of where they came from. I'm sort of in the middle of my book tour right now, and earlier this week on Tuesday, I was in Minneapolis, which is where my mother and my sister live. And I felt then that I had to give a disclaimer to tell people that they were not the basis of the book, because people have asked that a lot, and they say, is this based on your family? And I always say, no, it is not based on my family. This is not my family, and these characters are not me. But as I've been doing this, I realized that's actually not true. That the characters are based on me and my family, but not in the ways I think that most people expect. So let me explain what I'm talking about. So first there's James, who's the father of the family, and he's a Chinese American. As you saw in the little piece that I read, this is a mixed race family. And so James is not based on my father, but at the same time, he is. My father was a Chinese American man. He immigrated from Hong Kong in the 60s. And I saw some of his experiences as an Asian American man, somebody who looks very visually different from the people around him. He and my mother lived in West Lafayette, Indiana. Then they lived in Park Forest, Illinois, and then they moved to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and they moved to Cleveland, Ohio. And none of these places have very much of an Asian population, so my family always really sort of stood out. For a long time, the only Asian people that I knew were people who were related to me. And so what I saw was that people had a lot of assumptions about my father and about what he was or who he was and what he was supposed to be like. And that was something that he sort of had to deal with throughout his life, the expectations that people had before they even spoke to him. And so that was part of the inspiration for the character of James in the novel, the father. He likewise is a Chinese American man. And he also faces a lot of people's expectations. So, for example, he's a professor, but he is a professor of American history. And not only is he a professor of American history, but his specialty is cowboys. And he does this in the book sort of as a way to challenge people's expectations about who he is and to sort of needle them a little bit. And so I gave James that that sort of cowboy fixation. He really likes cowboy movies, and he teaches a class on cowboys. I gave him that partly because it suited his character. It was something that he, as someone who's sort of challenging people's assumptions, would like to do. But it also actually was inspired by my father, because my father, although he grew up in Hong Kong in the 1950s, was a huge John Wayne fan. And what was playing in the movie theaters at that time in Hong Kong was John Wayne movies. And so he saw probably every John Wayne movie that there was. And in fact, when he and my mother were dating, his idea of a really good date was a double feature of a John Wayne movie. So my mom has also seen pretty much every John Wayne movie that's out there. And so for me, that was sort of a little hidden tribute to my dad, to be able to give this father in the novel one of my dad's own weird obsessions. Marilyn, who is James's wife and the mother in the novel, is a white woman from Virginia. And she likewise was inspired by my mom, but again, in sort of a slantwise way. She's actually not very much like my mother. My mother is a chemist and ran her own lab and has written science papers and done research and all kinds of stuff. And Marilyn in the novel is what they would have called at the time a housewife. But the inspiration for Marilyn actually came from my mother's cookbook, which I have with me as sort of like show and tell. So everyone always laughs when they see this, and I think it's because so many people grow up with this cookbook. So this is the cookbook that my mom got pretty soon after she moved to the United States. She cooked from it. This is the cookbook that I learned to cook from, the one that we had growing up. So I've baked many of the cookie recipes in this book. And it's a book that I have a really fond memories of and a lot of emotional attachment to. And it wasn't until I was an adult and my mom was downsizing to a condo, and I went home to help her pack and also to take my stuff out of her house, that I picked up this book again as an adult, and I actually read the text that was around the recipes. And I was really startled. So since I have this, I'm going to read you a couple little short bits. And those of you who've read the novel may find some of this familiar. So this is from the pies section with this like beautiful 1960s photograph of a pie. And this is what it says in the introduction to this section. If you care about pleasing a man, bake a pie. But make sure it's a perfect pie. And then it gives you the recipes, right? So here's another example. This is from the eggs and cheese section, which in this cookbook for some reason are grouped together. And this is what it says under basic eggs. The man you marry will know the way he likes his eggs. And chances are he'll be fussy about them. So it behooves a good wife to know how to make an egg behave in 6 basic ways. And here they are with helpful hints. All right, so I'll give you one more because this is one of my favorites. And this picture looks particularly 1960s to me in its color scheme. This is from Preserves, Relishes, and Garnishes. And this is what the cookbook says to get you really pumped about making your own preserves, relishes, and garnishes. It says, Betty's pickles, Aunt Alice's peach conserve, Mary's mint relish. I hope you can hear the exclamation points that this cookbook has inserted. Is there anything nicer than a gift you made yourself? Anything that gives you a deeper sense of satisfaction than a row of shining jars and glasses standing on your shelf? So when I read this, I was really startled, first of all, because I had gone all my childhood not knowing that this was in there. But I also was just really fascinated by this book and started thinking about what it might have been like to be a woman, and particularly an ambitious woman, at a time when even your cookbook was telling you that this was the sort of thing you were supposed to be doing, and this is what you were supposed to be getting satisfaction from, and sort of personal fulfillment. And so I ended up writing this cookbook into the novel. It was sort of the inspiration for the mother, because Marilyn, although she is a housewife, she had ambitions when she was younger, and she wanted to be a doctor, and it didn't work out for her. And at a certain point in the novel, she finds her mother's cookbook, which is this cookbook. And she reads those quotes, and that sort of inspires her to reconsider her life and to take some pretty drastic actions that have a big influence on what happens to her daughter, and that tie into her daughter's disappearance and death many years later. So James and Marilyn meet and marry in the 1950s, which, as I learned during the research for the book, was a time that interracial marriage was actually still illegal in parts of the United States. That was sort of a shock to me to find that it wasn't legal everywhere in the United States until 1967, when Loving v. Virginia was settled. But when they meet in Massachusetts, it is legal, and they marry, although it causes a rift in their families. And they end up having 3 children who are part Asian and part white. And that, again, plays a role. Sort of all the family history that comes into this plays a role in what happens to Lydia. The 3 children, I think that my sister probably read this book with an eye to going, which one of these is supposed to be me? And fortunately, she didn't see herself in any of them, and that's because they're actually all based on some aspect of me. I think as a writer, it's always sort of safe to base people on yourself, because then other people hopefully don't get mad at you for stealing their quirks. But Nath is the oldest child. He's the brother, and he sort of represents the science nerd side of me. As I think you heard in the introduction, I grew up in a family of scientists. So my mom is not only a chemist. My dad was a physicist at NASA. My sister was an engineer. And in visiting my mother earlier this week, I stayed with her, and I noticed that she has a periodic table shower curtain. I'm not kidding. And so I think that kind of tells you pretty much, like gives you a little snapshot of the kind of family that I come from. But I really liked science as a kid, and I did a lot of science as a kid, and I wanted to be an astronaut. And so it was sort of a wish fulfillment for me to give that obsession to Nath. Nath, the older brother, is growing up in the 1960s and 70s, which is sort of the prime time for the space race, and he really wants to be an astronaut. And so, although I learned that I got motion sick on the Ferris wheel, and therefore being an astronaut was probably not in my cards, it was really nice for me to be able to make my character an astronaut, and also get to watch videos of like the Gemini launch and call it research. But even though I came from a really science-oriented family, I didn't go into science. I became a writer, which I think some people might see as being really far removed from science. And this brings us to Lydia, who's the middle child, and also the favorite child, and also the one whose death is at the center of the book. If you remember from the passage that I read at the beginning, the physics homework that we saw with the little ticks, her mother has a lot of expectations for her. Her mother really does want her to go into science and sort of fulfill the dreams that she wasn't able to fulfill. And Lydia is the child who doesn't exactly want what her parents want. She sort of is torn between wanting to please them and wanting to go her own way. In writing her, I tried to remember what it was like to be a 16-year-old girl. And what I kind of remembered was feeling, on the one hand, like I could not wait to leave home, that I couldn't wait to be out on my own, to be away from my parents, to get to do what I wanted and not to have to do the things that they wanted. And at the same time, to be really kind of terrified of that same idea of leaving home, of being far away from my family, of having to be on my own, and of going into this field that my family really knew nothing about. And so I tried to give those sort of contradictory feelings and fears to Lydia tenfold. And that's sort of where some of the conflict of her character comes from. And it's also, again, part of the roots of the tragedy of what happens. There's a lot of unraveling in the book. And finally, there's Hannah, who is the youngest sister at age 10. And those of you who have read the book know that she's kind of a secretive child. She's always hiding under the table or around the corner. She's always listening in on her family. And this is because, frankly, I spied on my family when I was a kid. Harriet the Spy was one of my favorite books when I was growing up. And for those of you who don't know it, first, please go read it. It's a really great book. And it'll probably take you a day, because I think it's written for 6th grade or so. But the character, Harriet, wants to be a spy, and her practice for she wants to be a spy and she wants to be a writer. And her practice for doing this is to spy on all of her neighbors, including sneaking into a rich lady's house on the Upper East Side, getting into an old dumbwaiter, and like pulling herself up into the character's bedroom. So she does all kinds of eavesdropping, and I was very inspired by Harriet. And so when my mom would put the long tablecloth on the table at Thanksgiving, I would get under there and kind of listen for, hoping for some good gossip. Anytime my parents had a party, I would go upstairs and I would listen through the air register in my room, hoping that I would hear something good. This was partly because I was convinced that adults had to be leading more interesting lives than they appeared to be leading to me as a child. But also I think partly because I was just really curious about people and how they worked. And I think that my obsession with Harriet the Spy was less actually about the spy part now and more actually about the writer part, because I think that's sort of what writers do, is they listen to all these things and they try to put together people's stories and they try to make a coherent narrative out of it, to make a story that says, well, this caused this. I think it's a natural human impulse to do that, because I think that's how we make meaning out of what happens to us in the world. If we think that life is just a lot of random events, it's very hard to live your life that way. It's very hard to know what to do. But if you're trying to find reasons for things and you're trying to understand things and find patterns and see patterns, that's sort of how we find meaning in our lives and in everything that happens to us. And so Hannah, as the youngest sister, is able to observe all these things. She's quite young and she can't put it together, but she sort of acts like me as the author and like you as the reader in trying to piece together the story of what's happening to her family and trying to figure out how they ended up at this point. So that's a quick introduction to the characters and a little bit of the backstory of where they came from. For those who've read the novel already, I hope that you enjoyed hearing some of the sort of behind-the-scenes stuff. And for those who haven't, I hope that I've piqued your interest a little bit. But thank you so much for coming. Thank you for listening. And I'm happy to take some questions.
Okay, we've got 2 mics. If people will go to the mic, please. One here and one here.
It's such pressure to have to get up and go to the mic. But I teach also, so I'm used to calling on people. So
Hi. I'd like to ask you about the spooky narrative voice, which knows so much more than all the characters and is constantly refuting and contradicting them.
Great. Did you all hear the question? Okay. So the narrative voice was something that I really struggled with. I think writers often naturally sort of gravitate either towards the first person, which is the I did this, I did that, I thought these things, or the third person, which is he did this, he said that. And I'm usually sort of a third person sort of writer for whatever reason. That's my natural sort of comfort zone. Because there are a lot of characters in this book, I originally wrote it where there would be one section that was sort of from Marilyn's point of view, and we'd sort of follow her around and hear what she was thinking, but nobody else. And then there'd be a section from James's point of view, the father, and we'd hear his thoughts, but nobody else. And then we'd hear, the sister and the brother, and we'd sort of pass the baton around that way. And the problem with that was that I, partway through, significantly through writing the novel, like in draft 3, I realized that this was one of the things I was really interested in this story was the ways that people misunderstand each other. And so the ways, for example, if people are talking, or especially if they're arguing, that a person can say something and the other person will hear that word in a completely different way. The way that sometimes what you think you said is not what maybe your husband or wife heard. And so I needed some sort of way that the reader could hear everybody's thoughts at once. And so what I ended up doing was turning to what I guess is really kind of an old-fashioned technique of what we call the omniscient narrator. So if you think about, like Dickens, for example, is kind of known for doing this. There's a narrator who knows everything and who's telling you the story and is telling you information when you need to know it, and will sometimes comment on the actions of the characters and make little judgments as they go along. And I was really afraid to do that because I'm not Dickens. And the omniscient narrator, I feel like, is sort of like playing God. It's like you're the God voice who's talking through the megaphone. And so I struggled a lot in trying to figure out how to tell the story in a way that the reader would get access to everybody's thoughts and access to things that the characters don't even know. And so what I ended up doing was reading a lot of novels that use that kind of I like that you called it spooky voice, who can know things and who can tell you, yeah, she was wrong about that. Or, yeah, what she didn't know was this. Because I wanted the reader always to be able to see a little farther than the characters could. Yeah. Elliot?
I'm actually really glad this came up because I was just thinking about Lauren Groff's novels. She's another contemporary writer who uses the omniscient narrative voice, and it's true, not a lot of contemporary writers do. Yeah. But I was wondering when you started reading all these omniscient narratives, who were you reading? I mean, and were there contemporary ones?
This is a great question. Yeah, I think actually it seems like not a lot of contemporary novelists use the voice. And as I started to kind of dig around, I realized that it's a little more common than I had thought. It's not the Dickens, like, for some reason I always think of Dickens's narrator as being a man. He seems very masculine, and he's got a lot of opinions. And now I think there are actually a lot of books that are less pushy, but they still have these narrators who can tell you all sorts of stuff. So Anthony Mara's book that came out last year, A Constellation of Vital Phenomena, which is a phenomenal book, and I highly recommend it, is one of them. It takes place in Chechnya during a long period of Chechen civil wars, but the narrator can kind of tell you about different characters that are doing different things and weave together things that happened in the past and things that are happening in the present and kind of show you the links between all of those things. Edward P. Jones is The Known World, which won the Pulitzer a couple of years, maybe now many years ago. But that's also a book, I think, that uses the omniscient voice. It's a book about Black slave owners in the pre-Civil War South. And so he will periodically he'll show you a little girl who's walking up to her master's house, and then he'll tell you what's going to happen to her 50 years from then. And those are things that only a narrator could tell you. Elizabeth Strout, who I think is best known for Olive Kitteridge, which is a novel that won the Pulitzer also a few years ago. Her first novel, Amy and Isabel, also uses the omniscient voice. It's a story about a mother-daughter kind of claustrophobic relationship, and that was a book that was sort of a touchstone for me. And so these were books that I was reading to kind of reverse engineer and figure out how they did it. And also all books that I highly recommend that I enjoyed as a reader as well as a writer.
Where's the it's like hiding. So for those of us who read your book and can't wait for more Celeste Ng work, can you tell us a little bit about what you're working on now?
Sure. So I am, especially if my agent and editor are somehow listening to this, I am working really hard on the next book. I am working on it, and I've been thinking about it a lot. It's sort of on pause while I've been going on book tour, but I'm kind of itching to get back into writing mode. So I always find myself writing about families. That's just sort of the thing that interests me the most. So it's going to be another family story, and it's going to be set in Shaker Heights, which is where I grew up. And so I already told you that it's a lovely place, and I have really fond memories of growing up there. It's fairly racially diverse in terms of black and white. It's very progressive. It's very pretty. The flip side of that, I think, is that they're also really concerned with what people think about them. And so the example that I give, we've got a lot of quirks. So the example that I give is that on garbage day, you are not allowed to bring your garbage up to the curb because the street will look messy. So what they do instead is you leave your garbage in the back by your garage, which is also in the back because garages are ugly and we want the street to look pretty. And they have these miniature garbage trucks that are like about the size of golf carts and that drive really fast. And they drive down every single driveway and they pick up the garbage in the back and they ferry it out to the big garbage truck in the front so that there's never garbage on the front of the street and the street never looks messy. So there are a lot of sort of little quirks like that that I find really interesting, and it feels really metaphorically rich to me that you have to hide your garbage in the back and not ever let anyone see it. So I'm still working out the plot of the novel. It's something that I tend to work out as I go along. But it's going to involve a family that lives in this community and then a mother and daughter who come from outside the community who have some secrets in their past and the ways that those two families kind of get entangled with each other.
Hi.
Hi.
I want to ask this question without giving a spoiler for anyone who hasn't read the book, but I was just wondering, what was your inspiration behind the character Jack? Because at the closer to the end of the book, I was like, oh my gosh,
he has a secret, right?
Yeah, so I just thought that added like a whole new dimension to the book, but I just was wondering, with it being set and the time it was, and just how did you go about adding him in to the novel the way you did?
It's a great question. I'm glad you asked because Jack is actually one of my favorite characters. I feel like I'm not supposed to say that because it's sort of like telling people which your favorite child is. Jack is the neighborhood kid. He's the same age as the brother, the oldest child in the family, and he is sort of the neighborhood bad boy. Like he cuts school a lot, he smokes, he like drinks, he's I don't know if you can be a womanizer when you're like a teenage boy, but he's sort of like that. All right, apparently you can. I'm not going to ask where you get your authority on that from, but anyway, Jack was sort of a mystery to me. I thought I was writing this story about this nuclear family, and then as I started writing about them, this neighbor boy kept showing up. He showed up at the funeral. He showed up, when the kids were younger. He kept popping into the story, and so I was trying to figure out why my brain was adding in this character and what role he had to play. And he certainly does have a role to play in Lydia's disappearance. Nath, Lydia's brother, is very suspicious of Jack because shortly before Lydia's death, she and Jack have started to hang out, and he really doesn't like this. But I think the way that Jack really came about and the role that he plays in the story is that because he's a little outside the family, he can see everyone in the family a little more clearly than they can see themselves. They all have sort of big blind spots when it comes to their family members and to themselves, but Jack, because he's outside of that, can see a lot more clearly than they can. And so he is able to perceive a lot more, and he's sort of knows everyone in the family a little bit better than they know themselves, and that's sort of the role that he plays in the book.
I have been writing personal essays, nonfiction, and I've just started to take a class in fiction, and hearing you say that you're using your background but leaping off from it into fiction, can you give advice to someone who's trying to, how much do you how much do you take from what you everyone says write about what you know, but if you write about what you know, you're going to write a memoir. So how do you leap into your brain part that talks about the fictional aspects? Yeah,
this is a great question, and one that I think my students are always wrestling with. I write fiction because I have a really hard time sticking to the facts. I always want things to be a little different than they were. A good friend of mine who's also a fiction writer refers to fiction writing as life editing, because she says that she can then change things to be the way they ought to have been in real life. But real life is never that tidy. I think the saying about write what you know is sort of one of those well-intentioned writing maxims, sort of like start things in the beginning, and but I think sort of in some ways Grace Paley is known for saying instead of writing what she knows, she writes sort of what she doesn't know or what she wants to know. But I think that in any kind of fiction writing, there's some of what you have experienced, whether it's the actual details or whether it's the sort of emotional truth. And that's the part that you have to know. I mean, that's the sort of raw material that you have. And if you, for example, have experienced a loss yourself, or if you have had the experience of feeling like an outsider, whatever that is, you as the fiction writer can take that same emotional truth and put it into a new setting. And I think that's sort of the relationship between real life and fiction, if that makes any sense. I wish that I could give you a percentage, because that would be so much easier. Just like 40% of it should be from real life. But I think that the writer Laurie Moore has a quote where she talks about writing fiction being sort of like the relationship between the writer and real life is the same as the relationship between the cook and what's in the cupboard. What the cook cooks is not the same thing as what's in the cupboard. And so in the process of writing the story, I think those things always sort of change depending on, there's not a set ratio, but some of it, anyone who says there's no autobiography in fiction, I think is probably lying to themselves. Yeah.
Did you have a question, sir?
Did you become comfortable enough with the creepy voice to use it down the road? And why can't Jack and the creepy voice substitute for one another?
I guess I could have maybe told the story from Jack's point of view, but I think Jack also has some secrets. Jack is by no means all-knowing, and he's not necessarily the wisest person in the book, even if he's able to see the family clearer. There are certainly things that he does in the novel that maybe a wiser or maybe older person wouldn't do. And so I wanted to sort of have somebody who the reader could trust, because I think throughout a large part of the novel, the reader is not sure about exactly how Jack is involved in the in Lydia's disappearance. And so I wanted to give the reader like a tour guide, basically a tour guide through the novel, somebody who they could walk through and who they know would be giving them accurate information. As to whether I've become comfortable enough with the creepy voice, which is I think a term I'm going to start using in my next class. I hope so. I think the next book is also going to use this sort of omniscient narration because it's kind of fun to be able to comment on what your characters are doing and saying. Thank you.
Hi. I wonder if you could give us a little idea of sort of how you went about writing this. In particular, it's such a knockout of a beginning.
Thank you.
And whether that was your original beginning or some of the things that, if you can remember back to your first drafts, that kind of you started with but didn't keep.
Yeah, that's a great question. That was not the beginning. So the novel took about 6 years to write. I started it when I was finishing grad school, and then I worked on it and had a baby in the middle, which caused a little bit of a delay in the middle. And it went through 4 drafts, and every draft, the story basically stayed the same. But the structure of the book really changed quite radically. I was trying to figure out how to weave past and present together and to show the ways that the past sort of echoes into the present and the present sort of reverberates with the past. And it was really tricky. And so I spent a lot of drafts rearranging pieces of the same story and trying to figure out how they fit together. And so in the very early drafts, actually in the first 3 drafts, the beginning was quite different, actually. We didn't have the creepy voice. And you also didn't know that Lydia had died until about 40 or 50 pages into the book. The family didn't know, and therefore the reader also didn't know. And what I realized eventually was that was kind of pointing readers in the wrong direction right off the bat. It was asking them to ask the wrong questions. The reader was then wondering, well, is she alive or is she not alive? Whereas I always wanted the question to be, how did we get to this point? So what's going on? What was behind this whole story? It was really a surprise to me when the book came out, to find that some people referred to it as a mystery, which I took as a compliment because I think mysteries are really difficult to write. My mom is a huge fan of mystery stories, and so we always had a lot of them around the house. We had like Ellery Queen magazine and a lot of like Agatha Christie and things like that. And so when I was about 12, I decided that I would write a mystery story, and then I would send it to Ellery Queen, and then I would become famous at age 12. And so I wrote a story, and I gave it to my mom, and I see some familiar faces, so some of you know my mother. And she read it, and then very tactfully said, well, I think this is good, but I think maybe you should make it more complicated. Because what happened was that there were only 3 characters in this story. One of them was the victim, and then one of them was the policeman. And so it was pretty clear early on who wrote it. And I took that as a sign, and I think an accurate one, that I don't have the head to put together a mystery. And so that was why I decided to put that opening right up front. You will know right away. That's sort of the big spoiler. The question is never, is she dead or is she not dead? The question is always sort of, what happened to her?
Okay, we got time for one more question. We can take a hand from the audience.
Over here? They're
okay,
tied.
we'll take 2.
Okay.
We'll
Okay.
take
So
2.
you first, and then we'll come to you because he had his hand up first.
Me first?
You first, yes.
Okay, now you published this book through a commercial publishing house.
I did publish this book through a
So
commercial
they
publishing house.
actually own it,
That is not exactly true.
but it's pretty close.
It's not actually that true. No.
Did you give any thought to self-publishing?
So first I want to, I don't think it's exactly true that they own the book because it's actually still mine. I did give some thought to self-publishing, I think in the way that most authors do when they consider all of their options. But for me, getting published with the Penguin Press, which is a branch of Penguin, the sort of big publisher, really I think was the best choice for me. They put a lot of energy and resources into the book that I would never have been able to do myself. So in addition to getting to work with a fabulous editor who, again, because she had distance from the book and could see it a little better than I could give me feedback and say, this part needs work, or this part I don't understand, so help me understand why this is happening. The book would not have achieved what it did without that publisher, without the support that they gave it and me, without them sending me out to go on book tour, and it wouldn't have been as good of a book. Now, that's not to say that self-publishing is not a good option for other people, because you can work with an editor, you can work with a cover designer, but for me, this definitely led to a book that I could not have produced on my own. And I think it's worth, somebody asked me at one of my readings, which I found delightful and hilarious. She said, I haven't read the book yet, but I have read the acknowledgments, which I thought was funny. But she said, I counted, and you have thanked 63 or so. She knew how many people I had thanked. And she said, why did you thank so many people? Which I thought was a funny question. And I said, I guess it's because my mom always taught me that I had to say thank you. But also because this book, I mean, my name is on the cover, but I think it's a little bit... it would be a false pretense for me to pretend that this book solely emanated from me and that no one else had a hand in it, because the truth is that many, many, many people had hands in it, from my editor to my agent to friends who read the draft to friends who didn't read the draft but talked with me about it, or who talked with me about things not related to the book and shaped me into who I am. I mean, there's so many people that are behind the book that I can't imagine not thanking them. So, all right, and now you will be the last question.
I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your writing routine, both when you were at Michigan and then afterwards, and if it changed at all.
Sure. So when I was at Michigan in the graduate program, we had a lot of free time. It was great. It was a time where we could kind of write and then sit in the coffee shop and talk to each other and then go home, and then we could stay up until 3 a.m. and write. And so when I left Michigan, I was very particular about my writing. I had to be in the right mood. I had to have my cup of Earl Grey and my Swedish fish, because that was like the magic snack. If I wasn't in the mood, I didn't write that day. And when I wrote, I would stay up until like 3 a.m. And I'm a night owl, so my best thinking tends to happen between like 10:30 at night and 3 a.m. And then I had my son, and that really had to change my schedule. And so I became a lot less picky about when I wrote. I wrote when he took a nap, I wrote when he was at daycare, and now I write when he's at preschool. And so now every day I try and write a little bit. And I don't think one's better than the other, but it's been an interesting change. There's a momentum that happens when you write every day that I'm sort of enjoying right now. So thank you all so much.